Welcome to the Moved to Meditate podcast. I'm your host, Addie D. Hilster. This is a place for vibrant discussions about mindfulness, movement practices, and ways to find more balance and presence in daily life. Here you'll find resources to help you progress on your path, as well as insightful conversations with mindful movement, yoga, meditation, and Dharma teachers from a range of traditions. On this podcast, we spotlight embodied approaches to mindfulness and the more contemplative aspects of movement practice. Listen in and connect to a community of like-minded practitioners. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me on the podcast today. I am really excited to share this conversation with my guest, Scott Odom, because I found it so interesting and inspiring. His path is really different from mine, and I found it really helpful to hear about his practice and his perspective on mindfulness and Dharma teachings, especially in relationship to the world we live in. Scott is a retired police officer, and he currently lives in the desert on the outskirts of Palm Springs, California, with his wife and 2 dogs. He's also a Dharma practitioner in the Karma Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism. We met several years back on a retreat with Bodhi Path, led by one of his main teachers, Lama Kadrup Zangmo. I knew Kadrup a bit, and she had invited me to teach yoga on the retreat, even though I'm way more steeped in Theravadan Buddhism and insight meditation. So you'll hear a bit about that as I talk to Scott about some of the practices he's done from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. We also talk a lot about his experience working as a police officer and what he learned from it, the positives and the negatives, and how it eventually led him to seek a spiritual path in order to cope with the trauma involved in his work. You'll hear how the Buddhist concepts of basic goodness and universal compassion began to shift how he saw others, and to help him move out of a survival mode where he tended to view people as either a threat to deal with or just kind of neutral and irrelevant. I think you'll really enjoy this interview because Scott is such an interesting person. And towards the beginning of the episode, I asked him about his 4.5 years leading a nomadic life in an airstream after he had retired from police work. So he shares what it was like to be on basically a traveling Dharma retreat in the airstream of consciousness. His spiritual path is also included working with ayahuasca in the Santo Daime Church and exploring the Santeria Espiritismo tradition. And while we didn't really get into those aspects of his experience, there are a lot of insights here about being a seeker, encountering different practices, and integrating different phases of your life or parts of yourself on the path. He's really kind of a mystic, and you can find him on Instagram and read his poetic descriptions of his inner work and practice. Okay, last thing as we prepare to head into this interview, if you learn something from this episode or feel inspired by this conversation, or you think of someone who could benefit from hearing this, please pass it along. Send this episode to a friend, post it on social media, or give us a review on Apple Podcasts, which also is a great way to help people find the show. Thanks again for being here today, for listening, and I hope you'll really enjoy this interview with Scott Odom. Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us on the podcast today. I have with me here Scott Odom, who is someone I met on retreat and who is a really dedicated Dharma practitioner. And he's also a retired police officer. And Scott, I know you also spent a few years living and traveling in an airstream, which, if I remember correctly, I saw it called the airstream of consciousness, or maybe that was your Instagram handle that stuck with me.
That was.
But you just have such an interesting path. So I thought it would be fun to talk today about your practice and how it's evolved over the years, how you've let it evolve over the years, and how you've integrated different experiences you've had and different traditions that you've practiced in for yourself. Because I really think it's valuable to listen to other people's stories and hear about other people's practice journeys, because we all are really different and there's so many ways to be on a path. So why don't we start kind of in the middle of your story and like work backwards and forwards from there, and just starting with the airstream life and how you decided to take up a nomadic life for a while and what that was like.
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. Um, I think that was primarily driven initially by my wife. Um, we were living on the Central Coast in California. I was working as a cop, um, and we were dug in pretty hard into that small town life and very visible. And she was always looking for a way to integrate travel into our lifestyle, but raising a kid and dealing with work, it was hard for me to get away. So she started initially buying a van, and I outfitted it for her, and she would take off and go on her own and get some time alone. And I think it was that seeing her do that and seeing her come back so recharged and so happy, it sort of planted the seed for me. And she was very skillful in letting that seed blossom slowly and not yanking on it, trying to get me involved too quickly. Um, yeah, so when it became time for me to retire, which was kind of prompted by my pilgrimage trip to India with Dawa, um,
Mm,
coming back from that, I realized how fast time moves and how important the Dharma was to me. And I wanted to structure my life in a way that would support deeper commitment to practice. So came back from India and crunched the numbers, retired as soon as I could. We sold the house, we bought the Airstream, and we started traveling around the U.S. Full time, just living in the Airstream and camping. We spent most of our time boondocking, so out in the wilds in BLM land and not really associated with a campground. And I had that opportunity to practice as much as I wanted in the midst of traveling and decompressing from police work and getting to have a lot of real good quality time with my wife. It was a really beautiful experience. And we did that for 4.5 years.
wow.
Yeah. And it was, richer and more wonderful and more unpredictable than I could have predicted. And it really helped me develop, I think, a lot.
I mean, it sounds kind of like having a traveling retreat,
For
for a
me, it
long period of time.
For me, it very much was a traveling retreat. I made the opportunity to visit Dharma centers everywhere that we went and receive teachings and make connections and get a feel for what Dharma looks like in the West outside of my own tradition and outside of, just the centers that I'm familiar with.
Hmm.
And to spend time meditating and practicing in the mountains, in the desert, by a lake, by the ocean, downtown, all over the place, all over the US. It was really, really beautiful.
It sounds beautiful, and I think it sounds like something that would appeal to a lot of people, but very few people would make the radical leap to doing that.
Yeah, I think it does require a certain amount of recklessness.
Well, you could say courage, you could say,
Yeah.
recklessness. I'm sure there were moments were there moments where you were like laying in bed at night in the Airstream and you wake up and you go, "What am I doing?"
I never questioned it. Once,
Really?
yeah, I think I was questioning it a lot beforehand. Like,
Yeah.
when I'm retiring early, I'm leaving a lot of money on the table, not sure that the numbers are going to work, getting the house ready to get on the market at a difficult time. I really chewed on my liver a lot, um, waiting for it to all come together. But once we made the leap, it was just like so joyful, so
Mm.
blissful, so freeing, intoxicating, really. And, you know, we find over and over again that when we leap, then the net appears, right? The support that is necessary for whatever endeavor we're undertaking is really not available to us until we make that commitment. until we jump off into the void. And then usually it'll be there. Sometimes not. Sometimes you just crash. But for us, it was totally supported. And I think every day was just a sense of gratitude, deep, deep gratitude, to be in the position where we could do that. Gratitude for my wife for leading the way. Gratitude for all my teachers who instilled in me such a deep longing for the teachings and for a deep commitment to daily practice, so that all the conditions came together in a way that was really exciting and really beautiful.
Yeah, that is amazing. The way that the path just sort of unfolded in front of you once you started taking those steps forward.
Yeah, and I found that to be the case, you know, ever since I got on the path. And I think even before I got on the path, everything was conspiring to bring me to a connection to that. So,
Well, let's go back to before you got on the path, because I know that your background was being a police officer, which sounds like a pretty different lifestyle than the one you lead
mm,
now. And I'm just kind of curious about that side of you and how you got into law enforcement and what that was like for you.
sure. Yeah. Well, my dad was a cop from the time I was 2 or 3 years old. So I grew up with that in my life and that kind of influence. And he was a larger than life figure for me, still is. Um, but I think as a boy growing up with your dad as a cop, I just totally idolized him, and I thought being a cop was the most glamorous superhero kind of thing that any guy could do.
Were you guys in California or somewhere
No, we
else?
were in Texas and
Oh, okay.
Michigan. Yeah, we were all over the place. Um, but I didn't think that it was part of my path or would be part of my path,
Hmm.
until later on in life. And I really got into it just looking for uh, some stability and pay and benefits, health insurance, all of the mundane aspects. And I thought, I could probably do it okay. And so when the opportunity came, I jumped into it, and it was a big transformation.
Hmm.
I'm not a cop. I'm like, that's
That's
not
not your
my
the heart
my
of who you
inner.
are, your
Yeah,
essence.
yeah. I'm kind of liberal. I'm kind of intellectual.
You're an
More,
artist as well.
yeah, an artist, and
Yeah.
into all of that. So for me, it was this beautiful opportunity to take on a whole new persona
Hmm.
and develop a completely underdeveloped aspect of my psyche. So I had to learn how to work with power, with personal
Mm.
power, with power on loan from our society, basically, you know, given the badge and the gun and sent out in the world to do violence on behalf of our society for supposedly a good cause.
Hmm.
So I had to really change myself. And I jumped into that like I tend to do with everything. Um, and I really loved it. I really loved experiencing the world through a totally new paradigm. And
Hmm.
I felt like what I was doing was important and it was valuable and it was exciting and interesting and challenging. It completely captured my attention 100%.
Hmm.
And the first few years, I think, of building a new persona and adopting the whole cop role, it was just a rebirth and really exciting and really, I think, necessary for my soul to develop a little more power, a little more hard edgedness, a little more comfort with working in the relative world and getting out of my head and being out in the world. But it also took a tremendous toll on me.
I can imagine.
The exposure to all of the things that I loved. Like, I want to be at the pointy end of the spear. I want to be right there when the blood and smoke and screams are in the air. I want to be involved in that up to my elbows. And I was, and I loved it, but it also, yeah, started to pull out some qualities in me that weren't not very beneficial,
Mm,
and that I don't think I had a mechanism to process the trauma that I lived in. Like I was just swimming in it all the time.
hmm
And then our daughter started getting involved in drugs and criminal behavior, like as an early teenager. And that started to exacerbate my feelings of suffering. And eventually, I was in a pretty dark place. I was very unhappy at work, even though I loved the work. I didn't, I just began to see the whole world through the lens of a police officer. So
mm,
everyone was either a threat that I needed to deal with, or they were an ordinary citizen that I could just ignore. So there was just
hmm
bad people and neutral people.
Well, that's like kind of being in a survival brain, right? Like where the brain is
Yeah,
just scanning for threats and it's just looking for what is a problem. And if it's not a problem, then it is like, who cares? It
right.
doesn't even like rise to the level of noticing, right? That's
Yeah,
that's kind of what it's like to be in that survival state, which I can see why like that amount of exposure to other people in survival state or going through a trauma or being in the that moment of blood and smoke and fear and um, that could just it just would shape your mind in that way, right, over time. We always
yeah,
talk about that in like in the dharma, that like what we're paying attention to shapes our mind. It shapes how we see the world. And so yeah, your story is a really interesting example of that.
yeah. It did completely change my experience of the world that I lived in. It became one of threat and danger and judgment, and um, I just I lost the ability to connect to my own heart. Although I wasn't aware of it, like I thought while I was in the midst of that, that I was on top of the world in some ways, that I had everything figured out. I knew how dangerous the world was. I knew how gullible everyone else was and how they could live in a fantasy world. And I was seeing the real world,
Mm.
completely unaware that this real world was completely shaped by my expectations and experience. Um, and yeah, it's a very, very powerful teaching on the power of our attention, the power of our awareness. We do live in highly individual worlds, and it's not the same for everybody. Even two cops in the same cop car, a man and wife in the same marriage, children and parents in the same family. We all have completely unique take and a completely immersive environment that's our own, that's based on that attentional quality and based on the patterning of that attention over time. So yeah, I found myself like deeply, deeply immersed, and then immersing myself ever more deeply, intentionally, thinking that somehow that would get me to the depth of something that would fix everything.
Hmm.
Like the thicker I made my shell, the safer I would be, the harder I hit and the harder I went out into the world, the more I could make a difference and be of benefit. But it was not a very skillful way of relating to my experience. And pretty soon the wheels were coming off in a lot of bad ways. And that's what led me to the Dharma.
Which is an amazing, turn to make, given where you were and kind of what you were seeing around you at the time. But I can see how empowering, I can hear like that part of the story, like
Mm,
that being able to find yourself in the role of being a protector and a leader and someone who could like step in and solve a problem and like keep their head in a crisis and embrace that the power in that way. I can see where that was attractive, but then
Mm,
it becomes like out of balance in a way when it starts to be the dominant tool, um, and you forget about other aspects of yourself that you could be bringing to the table because they're not encouraged in that environment.
totally. Yeah, very much so.
So was it, while you were still in this police role, this cop role, that you started to practice the Dharma? And how did you start? Did you start with meditation or like finding a class or like a book, or what was that?
Well, I've always been a voracious reader, and I had been reading about Buddhism and reading Buddhist texts from the time I was a teenager. So it's kind of an armchair Buddhist. I wasn't
Mm-hmm.
practicing, I didn't identify as a Buddhist, but I really, in all my readings, I always had an affinity for the Buddhist path. And I thought those guys have their finger on the pulse of something important, and they have good clarity and good understanding of the mind. So when my own relationship with my mind began to fall apart and I was losing my stability in a really clear way, I was in just a bad shape. But I didn't want to pursue any of the traditional treatment methodologies because I didn't want to lose my job or lose my assignments, get taken off the
Oh,
street.
so like if you'd gone to therapy or something and been given a diagnosis, it would like go in your record and
Exactly.
oh,
And then no more SWAT team, no more detectives, no more out in the
okay.
smoke and the blood, right? And so that just was not something that I was willing to pursue, even though like it was pretty
That
cut and dry.
conflict is really problematic. Like that could
Oh,
really be preventing a lot of people from getting support and help they need to even continue doing what they're doing in a way that would be of service to humanity.
it's a huge problem, and the men and women who are doing that job now are not in any better position, I think, than I was at the time.
Wow.
There's a huge stigma associated with seeking treatment and receiving treatment. Um, and it's understandable, like from an administrative point of view, we don't want damaged cops who are in crisis, out answering calls, dealing with violence, carrying guns. Um, we have to have some mechanism to safeguard against that. But I think the difficulty is that the current system seems to put the onus on the individual officer to seek out treatment
Hmm.
and um, identify their needs. When, as soon as you take that step, the consequences for your career can be very negative.
Hmm.
So, and I don't know what the answer is. There needs to be some sort of mandated safety net for
Yeah,
everyone. And
maybe everyone should be required proactively to just have treatment and support where it's just like an assumption that everyone is receiving that, because
right,
then you have, then you have
there's no
ways of,
stigma.
there's no stigma, and we're all in it together instead of it being this thing where more often than not people are probably hiding the fact that they need help and they're in
Yeah,
denial, and then they're acting out in some of the ways we see, um,
yeah,
really harming others.
yeah. And that was, I didn't want to be, I didn't want to harm myself. I didn't want to harm others. But I recognized that I was not capable of dealing with the load that I was carrying in the way that I was trying to deal with it.
Hmm.
So, perversely, that obstacle that kept me from engaging in traditional therapy made it easier for me to jump into the door of the Dharma. I decided, okay, I need to fix my mind. I need to fix my relationship with my mind. The Buddhists have a pretty good grasp on that, I think. So I need to find a Buddhist center and start establishing a meditation practice with the support of a group of fellow practitioners and a teacher. That way I'll stick with it. and I'll be able to figure everything out on my own secretly. No one will know. I'll get better, and I'll be able to keep doing my job and alleviate some of the suffering that I was feeling. So that was the intention that I had going into it. But of course, as soon as I met Kedrub, as soon as I met Dawa, as soon as I connected with those teachers in the Bodhi path, I was like, oh, something else is going on.
It became a much bigger thing.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah. It
It,
totally opened the door to something that was not just healing and beneficial, but transformative and something that my soul had been calling out for, seeking, in its very depths. So, yeah, it worked out just beautifully, perfectly.
I love that how the obstacle, the problem became the it instigated the solution or the next step on the path.
Yeah, and that just becomes more and more true, I think, as we mature as practitioners. Those obstacles, we begin to relate to them as our precious guides and our precious teachers because they bring with them so much. If we're willing to meet with them directly, like we can't try to skirt around those obstacles or deny them or smash through them. We have to relate to them skillfully. But when we're able to do so, sit with those obstacles and sit with those difficulties, in my experience, they always reveal the greatest treasures.
Yeah, yeah. We met on a Bodhi Path retreat in Badger, California, middle of
Yes.
nowhere, several years ago, because Lama Kadrup, who you mentioned, had asked me to teach yoga on the retreat. And I knew her from a different sitting group in Pasadena that was just a really informal group where we would meet at someone's house on Friday mornings and meditate. And it was mostly insight meditation people. So
Mm,
I wasn't really very familiar with Tibetan Buddhism going in. Like I knew a little bit about, but I'd never practiced it. So I went on the retreat and was just like immersed in the practices that you guys were doing, and really enjoyed experiencing some different ways of practicing that look quite different than what I had done before,
mm.
because there's a lot more devotional elements and more chanting and um, visualizations and things like that compared with like insight meditation, which some people call the dry path. You know, we like it boring and dry. But it's not as colorful, right? So
Right.
I'm really curious, what drew you to Tibetan Buddhism and that in particular, and what spoke to you about the ways that those practices are offered.
That's a really that's a great question, and I'm happy to talk about it because it's not that I was attracted to the bells and whistles of the Tibetan style. I sought out a center. It happened to be a Tibetan center, and I made that connection. But I was off put by all of that display. I didn't like the prayers. I didn't like the chanting. I didn't like the visualization. I didn't like
Interesting.
any of that. But I was so unwell and I was so desperate that I just had made the commitment. Whatever they say to do, I'm going to do. And I'm going to do it the way they say it. And I'll just see what happens. But I'm putting myself in their hands. And, I'm sure that karma has a lot to do with why that path opened for me. But what I experienced was as soon as I began to do these practices, the outer world changed. Like I didn't experience myself changing so much. I saw the change in the outer world,
Oh, that's interesting.
right? I'm
Huh.
very thick-headed.
Well, it's like the reflection of what's going on inside of you, and you're
Yeah.
seeing your
I think I
perception
was
is shifting. And
I was so cut off from my own emotional state and bound up in the suffering that that's all that I could really still see and taste and feel. But I began to see that the outer world, instead of being populated by assholes and terrible people. There
Or
were some,
totally neutral.
yeah, right. There were
Totally
suddenly,
irrelevant people and jerks. Right?
right, yeah. There were suddenly people in a third category. There were people that were nice. There were people that were interesting. There were people that
Mm,
were, um, just like alive in a normal way
mm.
and not part of that lens through which I was seeing the world. And eventually, as I pondered on that, I realized, okay, that is actually a reflection. There's something that is happening inside me that I still can't see or feel that's resulting in me experiencing the outer world in a different way. And then that very quickly opened up access to my inner state and to what was happening. And once I was connected to that and the teachings and the practice, it caught fire for me very, very quickly.
That's a really beautiful way for that process to unfold, I think, because it's almost like watching the world go from gray into color, or it just came alive in a different way, to just like
Completely.
notice, oh my gosh, I've been missing all this goodness that's actually here.
Yeah. And it was so powerful. It really helped me see, okay, what I'm experiencing is a result of my mind. It's a result of a kind of sickness in my mind. And these techniques and practices are bringing some flexibility and some openness to my habitual thinking patterns and emotional reactive patterns. And it's trustworthy. It's easy to do. I can actually do it, and I see the effect. Um, and then, yeah, that ignites that devotional aspect. And I found that once that devotional aspect was ignited, my gratitude for the teachings, my gratitude for the teachers who were so kind and so helpful and so patient with me, um, really was just like dousing that fire with gasoline. And I came to have a deep, deep love for all the bells and whistles, all the visualization practices and chanting and um, everything associated with the Tibetan way of practicing. Even though it was very foreign to me and off-putting at first, I think the ego didn't like it, but the heart was hungry for it.
Hmm.
And of course, none
What?
of that is necessary, right? None of those outer forms, they don't have to be Tibetan. They don't have to be chanting and praying, and they don't have to look like that. But for me, they did.
Yeah, that's what I found so wonderful about going on retreats with my Bodhi Path friends, because it's not my main practice, but I really learned to appreciate it and to see how it's the same Dharma. It's really the
Mm,
same teachings, but that they could take all these different forms and have all these different expressions, some of which are more artistic or symbolic, some of which are really straightforward, but it's just like I was saying before, that there's so many different ways to be on the path. There's so many ways for the path to be expressed. And so I just, really recognized the same teachings in there, but just, the sort of like myriad ways that it could be taught or illustrated or celebrated or engaged with. Just really cool.
yeah, I think it's really beautiful, and I think that there's a there's a spaciousness in that that can save us from becoming overly dogmatic about our own particular style of practice and our own particular approach,
Hmm.
um, to recognize the underlying truth of the Dharma, which penetrates everything. Um, and then you recognize, yeah, we're all different. We all have different strengths and weaknesses and affinities. And it's beautiful blessing that there are so many different paths available to each of us to fit our own proclivities.
And it's right there, like in all of the daily chanting on retreats. It's, you're doing these rituals and these processes and these things, but at the same time you're chanting about emptiness. Like, this is
Yes.
all empty anyway.
Yeah.
We're choosing to do it, we're making a whole thing out of it, and we're seeing right through it. So it's like
Totally.
right there. It's right there.
Yeah.
Which I love. I love the paradox of that.
That makes you a good Buddhist.
Yeah,
Embracing that don't know mind.
yeah. One of the things that came up for me when you were talking earlier about kind of finding your way onto this path and the way that originally manifested for you was that in your tradition, one of the things that I heard here talked about a lot is basic goodness,
Mm,
like recognizing our basic goodness, which is so different from, I grew up in like kind of the fundamentalist Christian sin and,
original sin.
original sin and like basic badness,
Right.
basically. And so this is, to me, it's such a refreshing teaching to see the goodness in each of us and the potential for that. And it sounds like that was sort of like a first awakening for you to the possibility of goodness.
Oh, that is so true. I remember, you know, distinctly this call for us, we're doing this for the benefit of all beings, and all beings are good and they should be free from suffering, and we want the best for them and we want the best for ourselves. And um, just feeling like, no, I don't like everybody else. I don't care about everybody else's feelings. I'm miserable. I need to be saved. I need to do something to put the fire out on top of my head. But I will say the words, and saying the
Mm,
words over and over again allowed that medicine to penetrate my thick shell of protectiveness and self-involvement. And it was it was not it was like the heart opened before the mind opened.
mm,
And it was completely transformative to go from a world where everyone is an idiot or a bad person or invisible, to a world where the basic assumption is no, everyone's good, everyone's doing their best, everyone is worthy of love and compassion no matter what is happening. And that included me, right? I realized very quickly that I was not receiving any love from myself, no compassion from myself, just judgment.
mm.
Um, so, yeah, I think that idea of basic goodness was a revelation for me, and not something that I was willing to believe. It was something that I was willing to pretend was the truth.
Fake it until
Um,
you make it, right?
Yeah, yeah, and that is exactly how it worked for me. I was like, I would say all the words and the prayers, and under my breath, I'd be like, "This is stupid. This is not going to
This
work. This
cannot be
is
right.
this is not right. It goes against all of my experience and all of my judgment. Nevertheless, I'll say it." And then, I was shocked that it actually cracked me open.
Hmm,
I think that's the most. It's just always for me the power of the path to work despite my own ignorance, despite my own confusion, despite my misunderstandings. If I was willing to do the work and in whatever way I was capable of, then it somehow penetrated and worked its magic and made a difference. And that just, yeah, I'm so grateful for that. And that guides me going forward. It's like I know I don't have to know everything about this practice or anything about this practice. I can just jump in and begin swimming, and then it will ripen as I increase my connection to it. So it gives you
hmm.
this tremendous sense of trust and freedom and a willingness to explore and experiment. I think that's really beneficial.
When you first started practicing, you were still a cop. So, what was it like for you to start stepping back into your work situations with, you know, this bodhisattva ideal in the back of your mind? Did that immediately change, or was it like kind of compartmentalized for a while, or did it just mess you up? what,
No,
what was that like?
that's a great question. Um, I think it it reignited this passion that I had for the job, because I really did get into it hoping that I could be a benefit, hoping that I could be helpful. And suddenly I had some techniques and a whole set of guidance to help me actualize that. So very quickly I did shift into viewing work as practice and seeing every incident that I was involved in as an opportunity to express the idea of basic goodness, to express compassion, um, and to be a bodhisattva, like on the street. And it was super helpful, and it transformed, yeah, how I approached everything. And I was able to spend a number of years um, on patrol and as an investigator with that view
Hmm.
guiding me through everything. And it was super helpful. And I have no doubt that the people that I was encountering were experiencing something unusual as well. You know, to have the difference between dealing with me before I got on the path and dealing with me after I got on the path, it was exponential. It's just so radically different. Even though I thought of myself before as someone who was compassionate and kind and uh, open in a way, I still was incredibly quick to violence and judgment and distrust. And afterwards, no matter what was going on, I could see the basic goodness in people.
Hmm.
I could see, oh, this person, even though they're making terrible choices and they're causing all this harm, it's arising out of their own ignorance. And they're going to need all of these consequences that are coming. But there's a way to deliver that with compassion, I think,
Hmm.
and to really just be with the people directly. I think that's really powerful.
The ability to actually just be present with things exactly as they are.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's where the rubber meets the road, right? It's
Hmm.
completely stripped down. There's no technique, there's no teachings, there's just presence and the willingness to be wide open exactly with things just as they are. And, everyone I think appreciates having that, especially when you're in a crisis mode, right? Somebody's just been seriously hurt or a terrible crime has occurred or I've just arrested them. It doesn't matter if they were victims or suspects or bystanders or family members. The ability to be directly with them always brought this sense of calm and compassion and ease into any difficult situation. It's very different from bringing anger and control and
Hmm.
judgment and punitive kind of behavior into the mix. So I found it was really beneficial.
Yeah, I wish that was the vision for how that job played out in society more often.
It's so hard. It's really hard. And I think,
Hmm.
you know, the men and women that I worked with, they were such high caliber people. They are. The people who are drawn to that, for the most part, are really good hearted people, very smart, and very committed bodhisattvas in their own ways. Like they
Hmm.
are willing to put their lives on the line. They're willing to go out there day after day and night after night and really risk everything in order for us all to have a life that's a little bit better. So I think the seed is there.
Yeah.
It's just that we don't have a good way of nurturing that seed. And then, no matter what, no matter how compassionate we are, no matter how mindful we are, we're still tasked with doing violence on behalf of our society. And sometimes that's just not doesn't look good and it doesn't feel good. And that's
Yeah,
that's part of the mission. So it's always going to be problematic.
because you're in extreme situations and sometimes it requires an extreme response to
Absolutely.
stop something more extreme from happening.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and that's always the danger I think with and what we as cops feel is like there's a danger in becoming too compassionate, too emotionally involved, too open, too available. we really do have a mission and a specific task that's distasteful and challenging, and nobody likes how it looks when we do it. Um, so,
Mm-hmm. Because you're afraid of making a mistake and missing something and allowing something to happen that you could have prevented.
absolutely.
Right. That
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah. If I'm
That's a
nice to
tough
you, if I get you a glass of water, if I take the handcuffs off and then you stab my partner, right? Like those are the kinds of things
that
that can happen.
would have been foolish to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a tough line to walk. That's a really, I don't think just anyone can do that, and that's why you're pointing to all these consequences for you, like being steeped in that for so long is very hard.
Yeah. It's definitely a super challenging space to navigate skillfully and to do so while mitigating damage as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it does. It takes a special kind of person
Mm-hmm.
to be able to do that.
Yeah, and then others may go the other direction where they become so reactive that they make bad judgment calls, and
Right.
they
You make you
you
make the
know
situation worse, right?
yeah, or you
Yeah,
make assumptions about people or their intentions and make huge mistakes that have
absolutely.
horrific consequences.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no safe decision and no safe ground. It's always um, a tremendous risk, either through taking action or not taking action. Um, it's always problematic, but it's the
Yeah.
greatest ground for exploring the nature of your mind and the nature of our human existence, and it's a really interesting laboratory.
Yeah, it's like an advanced course in exp- exposure to the entire range of human behavior, right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
In ways a lot of us are insulated from.
Mhm.
But I wanted to kind of go back to some of the Tibetan Buddhist practices. I'm really interested in movement practices and embodiment. And I found that that was incorporated into the practices, like on the Bodhi Path retreat and some of the Tibetan Buddhist practices you guys do. There was this like embodied element, especially through some of the Nundro practices, like the
Mm,
prostrations. I
mhm.
was not familiar with like this idea of doing prostrations, and that when I saw this being done on the retreat, I was like, oh, that looks like sun salutations,
Right.
right? Because it's like
Yeah,
this bowing process. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little about that, because the way the practice is structured is like there's this kind of progression. You do a certain amount of this embodied like bowing practice, and then eventually you move into different types of meditative practices as well. But so I'm curious if you did that practice, or what you think the role of that practice is, and what you'd say
sure.
about that.
Yeah. For me, the Nundro, beginning with the 111,111 prostrations,
It's so many.
it is so many, and thank goodness that it's so many because
How
it.
long did it take you to do that? Like years?
Oh, years. Yeah, years. Um, and it's great because it gives you a finishing goal, but it also keeps you in locked in the washing machine of that process long enough for you to really experience everything that you're going to experience, your highs and lows, your periods of enthusiasm and in periods of boredom and frustration. It really forces you to bring everything into that practice if you're going to continue it and sustain it. Um, and yeah, I think that those, especially those prostrations, were so transformative. I mean, you're doing the visualization, you're doing the prayer recitations, you're doing refuge and bodhicitta, and you're doing those prostrations. So it's body, speech, and mind all tied together. Um, and like for most of us in the West, it's very weird, right? The visualizations are strange. The words that you're saying are strange. The ideas behind those words are strange. The action of offering prostrations to a statue of a Buddha or to your altar, um, that's weird stuff, right? In the West. Um, and so there's a lot of opportunity for the ego to do battle with those ideas and get softened up. Um, and for me, I think there was a kind of weird twofold aspect to it. One is that I felt like such a good Buddhist for engaging, right? Oh, I'm
So
doing these,
pious. This is so
right.
strenuous, and I'm doing it. And yeah,
Yeah.
there's a whole, yeah.
And the whole strangeness of it just made me feel like, oh, I'm so special. I'm really doing something unique and unusual, and I'm so open-minded to give myself over to this practice. Um, and aren't I great?
So it becomes like a whole identity project for a
Yeah,
while.
it's just yeah, the spiritual materialism aspect of it. Even
Uh-huh.
for like I'm a genuine practitioner, I really wanted to do it the right way, but that was a big part of it in the
Mm-hmm.
beginning. Um, I wouldn't say that to anyone else. I wouldn't admit it, but it was like I felt
That,
special
that's
doing that.
probably a pretty common stage that one would run through doing that,
I
because it is like part of your mind taking this on board, that you're doing this thing that goes against a lot of your conditioning.
yeah,
That's like it is different, and it is like quite a project. It takes a lot out of you physically, and it's going to take a long time, and you've
yeah,
got these sore muscles, and you're like, what is this?
yeah. And I think too, I think from like my police academy experience, like taking on the persona of a police officer, I saw how valuable it was to have a uniform, to have a different language, to have a different way of walking, to have a different way of looking. And I sort of adopted that same thing when I dove into Tibetan Buddhism and into the Nundro. It's like, okay, this will make me a Buddhist. I will look and talk and feel and act like a Buddhist, so that'll be good for me. And then deeper, that practice totally transformed me, even though my ego was trying to wrestle it, control of it, and take advantage of it. um, the power of those practices, and I think specifically the embodied aspect of getting the physical body and the subtle body moving in alignment with that motivation. It was like my body became a Buddhist. My body opened up and became um, more compassionate, more aligned, more willing to be present with things as they are. And like everything else, my mind was the last person to get on board. But it was so skillful. It's so wise to have something that can be done kind of in a rote fashion, just like taking the medicine, and you don't really have to figure it out first. And then that medicine begins to work on you, and it opens up your awareness, it opens up your heart, and it makes you curious about going forward. So you take that energy and apply it into the next stage and the next stage. And um, it builds this tremendous sense of trust and confidence in the teachings, because it totally, as much as a basic sitting practice and listening to some teachings changed my life, jumping into the Nundro and giving myself over to that process, it absolutely turbocharged my development as a practitioner and um, my development as a human being. I think more than anything, that turned me into someone who was willing to love, was willing to um, just be myself directly with anyone, everything, whatever arose, I could be present with no problem. So yeah, very, very transformative and powerful. And it all points to our mind, right? These practices, although they have their own intrinsic power, they really do develop a sensitivity and awareness of how profoundly powerful our own mind is. It's really limitless. It's completely unbounded. It's completely open. And these practices, more than anything I've ever experienced, helped me to perceive that directly.
Well, beautifully described. And yeah, it was interesting for me to like see how that was folded into this tradition's practice, because there's nothing like really equivalent to that, I would say, like in the Theravadan
Mm.
schools. But
Mm-hmm.
my path was like I did yoga for like 10 years before I started to actually sit. And that is kind of similar. Like it started through the body for me, of like doing these practices of unwinding and just working things out on this more somatic level. And then I was ready to actually sit, because I don't really know if I could have successfully, if that's the word, but really productively meditated. I think I tried to meditate a few times, like earlier on in my yoga experience, and it just didn't really like click until it was ready to click. And I think all of that movement practice that I had done prior like really helped set me up for going deeper and actually starting to look at my mind, um, and seeing how, it's entirely not separable from the body at all. But
Yeah. Yeah.
you know
Yeah. They're definitely a package deal. And I think, at least for this incarnation, the body is essential aspect of our spiritual path, and anything that we can do to include um, a genuine connection to the somatic approach, curiosity to that, openness to that, listening, keeping that communication pathway open, and pouring energy into our connection with our body. Like for me, I live in my head. I The body is an afterthought, has always been an afterthought for me. So development of that somatic connection was really, really essential for me. And now I'm a firm believer in its necessity for us, for every breath, every movement forward. We can't do anything without that. And I think any spiritual path that doesn't include that somatic aspect is really missing a huge piece of the puzzle.
I would agree. Yeah, I think it's just one of the biggest pieces for me is just that they're not separate at all. And we
Yeah.
have this like illusion of like the mind is in charge and the body does its bidding. And that's really not accurate.
Not at all. Not at all. Yeah.
Well, we've been talking for quite a bit now, but I think if I wanted to close with anything, it's just kind of talking a little bit about, this world we're in and how much we look around and we see like there is a lot of uncertainty, a lot of distress. It seems like these days there's always a lot going on. There's a lot of crises. We're aware of a lot more of them now because, the access we have to seeing what's going on the
Mm,
planet. Um, and I think a lot of us who are practitioners sometimes like struggle with what is our role, and what role does our practice play amidst all of this. Like, does our practice matter? Is it
mm,
enough? Are we just like insulating ourselves away from reality, or are we doing work that equips us to more fully engage with it or see it more clearly? And I thought this would be interesting to ask you, as someone who really has seen like these extremes of ugliness and goodness in
mm.
humanity, and how you work with that, if that's something you reflect on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's impossible to look with clarity out at the world and not see the suffering. It's part of our existence here. And although our perception of suffering rises and falls based on what we're exposed to, suffering itself is always turned up to 100%. It's always happening to somebody
Hmm.
all the time. War, famine, disease, old age, sickness, death, confusion, all of that. It's always on fire, 100%. Um, and we are part of that fire, right? Our own suffering, the suffering that we experience, the suffering that we cause to others around us through our own ignorance and mistaken approaches. And so our practice is part of all of that too. And I think every breath that we take with kindness and with love as the basis of that breath makes a difference that we can't always perceive. It radiates out from us into the world, into the cosmos. And the farther it goes away from us, the bigger it gets, right? If you think about a ripple in a pond, when you first drop it in, those ripples are really small and they're close to us. But by the time they reach the edge of the lake, right, the entire surface of the lake is covered with these ripples. So, although we don't see the impact, I believe 100% that everything that we do, every drop that we put into the ocean of practice matters, is very, very important, and has an actual tangible effect in the world. We're all connected, we're all interconnected, we're all alive together. And everything that we do, everything that we think, everything that we say leaves a mark on every other being. Um, and we can have confidence that cultivating our own good heart, cultivating compassion for ourselves that begins in our own body, in our own heart, in our own psyche, and then spreads out, overflows that container, and goes out into the world. Not you get this and you don't get this, not in a pick and choose way, but it just floods out into our shared humanity. Um, I think that's pretty much the only thing we can do. I mean, of course, we always take relative action. If someone's hungry, we try to feed them. If they're hurt, we try to help them. We do whatever we can with where we are. But the suffering of the world is always vaster than what our two hands and our heart can deal with. So it's always going to be more than we can ask ourselves to do. But if we give ourselves wholly over to cultivating our own good heart, cultivating a compassion that is objectless, that flows without question out into the world, then we can be a force for good in the world that we can completely trust.
That's very inspiring. Thank you so much for sharing that perspective and all of your experiences. Um, it's really sweet and beautiful to see how you've integrated all of this, life on your path. Um, I'd like to just ask you where people might learn more about you or connect with you, or find some of your writings and your reflections. Um,
Sure,
yeah.
sure. I'm on Instagram at the Awakened Heart. It's all lowercase with underscore after the and underscore after awakened, and I think underscore after heart. But you should be able to find me with the Awakened Heart.
I'll put it in the show notes too so people
Okay,
can click on it.
great. Um, yeah, and that's about the only thing that I'm putting out there right now. So
Did you write a book?
I did write a book. Um, it didn't get any traction. There was a lot of interest and excitement at first, but everything sort of fell apart. Conditions weren't supportive. Um, and I could have gone forward with self-publishing, but I just felt like listening to, I guess, that feedback of, for some reason, it was important for me to write it, but I don't think it was important to get out to others in that form, I guess. So,
Oh, okay, interesting.
yeah, now I'm really glad that it didn't get published, and I'm glad that it stayed within. But at the same time, I learned so much from writing that book, and I got so
Hmm.
much benefit out of it that I'm sure it'll express itself in other ways.
Yeah, and you share a lot on your Instagram. It's just like the poetry of your practice.
That's a
And
beautiful way of putting it. Yeah.
yeah, I always enjoy your posts so much, and they're quite inspiring. So yeah, thanks for all you do.
Thank you. It was really great to talk to you, Addie. Great to connect again.
Yeah, same to you. Thanks for taking the time today.
Absolutely.
So that's today's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with a friend, subscribe on YouTube, or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and help others find it that way. To learn more about my work, the Moved to Meditate class library, courses, courses, or teacher trainings, go to movedtomeditate.yoga. This is Addie D. Hilster. Thanks so much for listening.